Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the LDRship Podcast. I'm Dion. I have with me Brett and Thea. Unfortunately, Will could not make it tonight. He's actually out stumping for his party tonight, so we wish him the best of luck, even though maybe we disagree with some of his policy viewpoints. So he hopefully will throw out a not an episode, just like I did a couple days ago, and he will have the benefit of being able to see everything that we talked about today and not have to come up with arguments on the fly. But he could actually sit there and take notes and come up with with well thought out and educated thoughts in his rebuttal to what we discussed tonight. But anyways, on episode 4 here of the LDRship Podcast, we will be talking about the economy and specifically what we each think the government's role should be in the United States economy. So I'm going to start with Brett tonight. Why don't you go ahead and let us know what is the Republican stance and how do you feel about it and where we should go?
Sure thing. Well, for those that don't know me, I am Brett Miller. I am the representative of the Republican Party here on the podcast. So, with that, in terms of the Republican standpoint, the main points that the platform rolls out is talking about defeating inflation, tax policies, energy dependence, manufacturing and trade, cutting regulations, improving industries in terms of innovation and emerging industries, and then also making sure that we're supporting the American workers. Right now, there's a lot of policies that kind of play around with how to do that. But when you look at inflation, for example, the big areas that the Republican Party looks to do is to reduce government spending, making sure that we're cutting back regulations. Another one would be to boost energy production. There's a lot of reasons for that it comes from, but getting that energy dependence is definitely a way to drive lower costs and increase the economic growth. Tax policies, the platform is to go back to the higher tax cuts, kind of going back to the first Trump era tax cuts and eliminating taxes in areas that they don't need to be. Because they realize that when Americans keep more of their money, they tend to spend more of it, which stimulates the economy. Okay. The energy dependence, it's a kind of all of the above strategy. Anything that we can do to have energy independence in America is what we're going to shoot for. Also end some of the restrictions of the Green New Deal and coming back to that prioritization of American energy dominance. Again, we can go back and look at history and show when that was deregulated and there was more to produce. I forget the time frame. I'd have to look back in my notes for that, but there was a window where the U.S. shot to the top in terms of energy production for the world. Okay. The manufacturing and trade stuff, getting to where we can go back to manufacturing to create jobs from that. There's a lot of points we could probably talk about that, but the biggest thing is just cutting the regulations, right? Regulations stifle job creation. It stifles economic freedom. When companies have regulations in place, they don't have the freedom to be creative. And so there's a lot of jobs that can kind of come from that. Emerging industries, things that tap into that area, stuff like AI, cryptocurrency, space exploration. These are all areas that it makes sense to foster and grow. It's kind of the cutting edge stuff that comes from that. I think that's kind of the main points that are there from the platform. My personal belief in a lot of that is, promotion of the free market, of understanding capitalism. And, I know, when usually the big C word gets thrown out there, capitalism, people kind of get upset about that and understand what it is. And I know there's a portion of the populace that believes that capitalism needs to go and that it is the rich exploiting the poor. And that's not really the case. If you understand what capitalism is supposed to be, that's not the case. There's another term that needs to be thrown out there, which is cronyism, that a lot of people are unaware of, because that is where you have these big industries that are kind of in bed, so to speak, with the government. And you have people in political positions that are doing favors for these companies. And that creates an unfair market, that goes against capitalism. Because I don't know, one of the quotes that I love about that is, under capitalism, man oppresses man, right? But in socialism, it's the other way around. So you start to think that, and it just goes to show that people are fallible, right? People aren't perfect. So it doesn't matter what system you put in place, there's a level of oppression that comes with power and corruption, right? So then you kind of have to look at, well, where do we thrive the most? And when you look at the economic charts of, the last 2,000 years of human history, there is a distinct, everybody sees the hockey stick graph where we hit, the 1800s and it shoots up. And everybody's, oh, it's the Industrial Revolution that caused that. Well, yes and no, because if you break that down further and you look at economic trends across different areas of the world throughout that time, they happen at different intervals in different time frames. You see an immediate spike right around 1776 that America starts to take off, right? And then there's a later around World War II where it increases further. Whereas you look at Western Europe, they delayed and they saw some growth, but they didn't really see a huge spike until after World War II. Same thing with Japan. They saw a spike after World War II where it was more of an open free market. Even China, when they went away from strict socialism and communism and started to adopt some free market trade policies, they saw a growth that came from that. It just makes you wonder where their country would have been if they had truly adopted the free market and operated from that. So anyway, that's kind of my standpoint is when it comes to the economy, let the market be the market. The government needs to kind of keep their hands off of it. It's not something that needs to be super regulated. Yes, you still need checkpoints to make sure that, you're not hitting all of these corporate greed issues and monopolies. I still believe there needs to be some, maybe keep a hand on the wheel, but you're not doing it to control it from that standpoint. So anyway, I've been talking for a few minutes. So
Thea?
It's interesting because I agree with Brett in the goal, but I disagree with Brett obviously in the how you get there. So the Democratic platform seeks to create a fair economy that creates opportunity across the board, and that and then when we talked in our first episode about what the Democratic Party, one of the big things that it seeks to stand for is to try to remove the barriers to equity. And so Democrats are capitalists. I don't think that, by virtue of us supporting certain regulations when it comes to the economy and
Sorry,
believing the government
can
plays.
I make sure that we have a clarification here? So
Mhm.
you did say equity, and I think
Yes.
most of us understand the word equity to mean that it is equal
I would say
results rather than
equity
equal
of
starting point.
opportunity. Well, I think equity of opportunity is how I'm phrasing it. So when I say equity, I mean, and that's where I was talking about removing barriers to entry, right? So a lot of, when we look at the way that our system exists, in a capitalist system, if you were just a truly capitalist market, it's kind of anything goes. Like you said, man regulates man. And I think what the Democrats seek to do is to remove the barriers and acknowledge the wrongdoing that happens within the economy, right? So you do have an equity of opportunity. That is why we're the party of labor. That is why we're the party that seeks to have to to support and invest in the economy in a way that allows America to progress in the global economy and not get stuck in the way we've always done it or stuck in industries that perhaps are evolving and how to be more flexible to adjust. And the thing I think Brett kind of hit the nail on the head. A lot of what when you hear Democrats talking about their economic policies, a lot of it is to combat the cronyism that you see, right? It feels like the Republican Party has put policies in place that favor large corporations and big business at the expense of middle class. And so when you talk about in the last few Republican administrations, the biggest economic policies that they pushed are tax cuts, particularly for the 1%, and that the concept of trickle down economics, I've never seen there to be any economic evidence that it's successful, that it helps support folks in the in the lower class, middle class, and it tends to lead to the inequities that we currently see in our economy. So I do think that when we talk about regulations, I'm not saying all regulations are perfect. I'm not saying that the government needs to have a heavy hand in regulating every aspect of the economy, but I don't think that pure capitalism, where different parties can go unchecked, is the right answer. So I do agree with the Democrats' perspective that there is needed regulations in particular areas. Now, I'm happy to discuss specific regulations that you think aren't having the outcomes that they seek, but I don't, the general idea that the government should stay out of it, or they shouldn't have a hand, or the government shouldn't be investing in the economy in different ways, I disagree with. And so I do support the Democratic platform in that way. And again, just to emphasize, so I'm not misspeaking or being misunderstood. I'm not naive in the sense that I think that the government's role should be to create an equity of outcome. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's life, right? But I do think that the government's role should be to remove barriers that keep people from being able to enter the market in ways that would be unfair, right? So I do, when Democrats talk about having a fair economy, having an economy that creates opportunities for folks in the middle class, I think that's important, right? And I'm a labor and employment attorney who represents corporate America, right? So it's not like I'm naive as to the interests of companies and stuff. But one thing I've always said when I'm defending my clients, when I'm advising my clients, that big business doesn't work in this country without a healthy workforce, right? So I think it's important to understand companies are not inherently evil. I don't believe that all corporations are bad, right? The lights are on in my house, and that's because there's a big utility company that operates in Southern California that allows me to have electricity. I'm using my internet and my cable and everything to be on Wi-Fi right now, so I can participate in this podcast. And all of those types of services typically are provided by very large companies, but that doesn't mean those companies should be able to operate unchecked in this country. So that's how I balance my opinion, and I look forward to us kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of this conversation, especially because we have an actual libertarian on here. So on that note, I'd love to hear,
Yeah.
Dion, where you're coming from on this.
Well, so I'll start with what the Libertarian Party platform says, and it says the only proper role of government in the economic realm is to protect property rights, adjudicate disputes, and provide a legal framework in which voluntary trade is protected. All efforts by government to redistribute wealth or to control or manage trade are improper in a free society. Um, so that, that is like, a lot of people would see that as chaos and anarchy, right? Just a completely free and open market just opens the way for monopolies and robber barons and crony capitalism and everything else that the two of you have already talked about. But I think it's important to say there that the Libertarian Party does recognize that there is a role of government in the economy, and that is to protect property rights, adjudicate disputes, and provide a legal framework for voluntary trade to be protected, right? So I think that if you take those three things broadly, I think that takes care of a lot of the things that you guys have been talking about, as far as the cronyism, as far as the corporate greed and the misalignment of incentives against y- you know taking advantage of the working class, those kinds of things. And so I think probably all of us, I think, agree there, which maybe for the listeners and the viewers, they're probably like, well, I didn't come here to listen to you guys agree on everything. But I think most rational people would agree on that. Here's where, and this is where I definitely agree with the party. I wouldn't say I toe the party line, but on the free market, this is kind of one of the places where time and time again, the examples that I see are that when the market is free and um, regulation is significantly limited by the government, that is when amazing things can happen, right? And so Brett, you kind of alluded to it, but I think it's important that we point out that in the 20th century, especially, uh, the rising tide of the world economy lifted all boats. You look at the amount, the percentage of the world's population that is in destitute poverty went from something like 40% at the turn of the 20th century to now we're down to like 5% worldwide. right? And that is an amazing change, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with the explosion of free markets around the world and the ability to get cheap and mass produced products and food everywhere. And you can't do that under a centrally controlled economy. I should say you can, but it becomes a lot more costly and a lot less efficient when you do that. I have a lot of examples of where the government intends to do things to improve the economy, and it ends up just being a complete mess. I'll just list one, and I think it's one that if anybody has gone to look for a used or new car anytime recently, you feel this. But in 1975, they were like, "Hey, we need stringent fuel efficiency standards." Part of it was um, ecological. Part of it was, hey, we're producing a lot of greenhouse gases. We want to bring those down. And so, we want to put these stringent controls on fuel. But also, they had the energy crisis back in the 70s. And so they were very mindful of that. They were tired of these V8, gas guzzling muscle cars that were just burning tons of oil. So anyways, they made the standards and everything, and so they said, okay, cars need to be more fuel efficient because that was like 80 some percent of the vehicles on the market at the time. And but it would not affect trucks that were used for farm work and commercial hauling and things like that. Well, automakers said, oh, let me take a look at these standards that you wrote. I can create something called a crossover or an SUV, and it's not a car. It's a light truck according to your definition. And now almost 80% of all new vehicles manufactured and sold are falling into the light truck category, which means that they don't have the stringent fuel economy standards. So we could talk about how, oh, well, the government should have tightened up their language or stuff like that. But that is just one of many examples of where the government stepped in to try to make something good happen. And what ended up happening is it completely backfired. So
Well,
I
I
have a lot of examples. Go ahead.
one thing I guess I want to clarify when we talk about government regulation as far as it impacts the economy is you have regulations that the purpose of the regulation seeks to um, the goal of the regulation may not necessarily be for an economic impact, but maybe for example, an environmental impact. I think the example that you gave about fuel efficiency can arguably, especially when we know where we've ended up since the 70s when it comes to environmental issues, that some of those regulations, yes, they have an economic impact, but the goal of the regulation wasn't necessarily to impact the economy. And I think that's true across the board with any type of government regulation. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to have some impact on the economy, but that may not necessarily be the purpose of it. For example, when you talk about the FDA, right, and you're talking about regulating, how different, food and drugs are made, how they could be sold and all that. Obviously, that has an impact of the price of the goods. Sometimes it has an impact on what can enter the market, what can't enter the market. That has economic impacts, but we still want to know that our Tylenol hasn't been poisoned, right? And that people aren't going to die because they use contaminated Tylenol. So there's always the give and take on, yes, these regulations impact the economy, but to not have them, what are the other impacts, the absence of that?
Okay. I mean, so we could talk about one fairly recent economic, I don't know if it's a policy, but it was an economic action that happened by our government, which was between 2020 and 2021. I believe the government printed like something like $2.3 trillion out of thin air to stimulate the economy. And I believe that led to record inflation, which everybody knew it would, right? You increase the amount of money out there, and then that will increase the demand for it, which means that people are going to raise their prices. So, should we talk about that? I mean,
I mean,
that's a recent
we can talk
example.
about that, but I will start with the first thing. I think as a Democrat, one of the things that gets me a little bit passionate, and you'll see me get a little bit more animated when we talk about economics, especially economics during the time period that you just spoke of. I find that a lot of times people speak of it as if it happened in a vacuum, as if COVID was not happening at that time, as if we were not all living in our homes, as if there was not this pandemic starting, as if that didn't have a huge impact. I think let's have a discussion about it. But I think it's important to make sure we don't we at least say, well, if we didn't do X, what would have been the alternative, and what would the impact of the alternative be given everything else that was going on at the time? Because it's one thing to say, oh, the government pumped all this money into the economy, it caused inflation X, Y, and Z. So then if we didn't do that, what do we believe would have happened? I guess that's a fair question. It's not rhetorical. What, from an economic stance, do you think would have happened had the government not stepped in?
Well, so I guess we would have to preface that by I also think the government should not have mandated that a whole bunch of businesses shut down and
Okay.
that everybody quarantine at home, right?
Okay.
So
Mhm.
you could argue that the pandemic could have had some economic impact, and we have at least two solid examples of places that did not shut down, did not have mask mandates, and did not have lockdown mandates, and that's South Dakota and Sweden. Switzerland,
Mhm.
Sweden. I don't know. You guys can correct me.
Mhm.
But one of those European nations did not shut down, right? And South Dakota did not shut down. And they saw a very minor economic impact because of the pandemic, right? Some people stayed home, some people decided to change their spending habits, some people lost their jobs, whatever, right? But by and large, if you don't shut down the economy, then you don't have to infuse it with $2.3 trillion either, right? So
But you're presuming, you gave two examples that were not densely populated locations. So you presume that the impact of the pandemic itself, you're discounting the fact that when you have a spread out population like South Dakota, as compared to a more densely populated population like Southern California, New York, any name a state that has a high population that's within close proximity to each other. When you don't shut down in those locations, now your loss of life will increase, which also would have an impact of the economy, right? Because the pandemic goes unchecked. So there again, it's always, you can do what you're explaining. Yeah, it may, and maybe it would have worked. We could have had different policies across the board depending on the populations and how they're distributed, and where industry, what industries are big in those locations. I'm not an expert on South Dakota, but I know a lot about California, and a lot of the agriculture in California is grown here, right? In both in our rural and some of our more populated areas. I don't think a lot of people realize how much agriculture comes from California. So again, yes, you can you can say, well, maybe the government shouldn't have had such a heavy hand with shutting down, and enforcing public health ordinances. But then what would the impact of the pandemic itself been had we not done that? You know,
Yeah, there's a lot of
I think this
what
is
ifs that
probably
kind of roll
the
around in that.
pandemic response is probably a topic for a whole
it is.
episode that we could do. I only brought that up to
It
talk
is.
about and maybe to segue into something that Brett and I were discussing a little bit before we got on this podcast. Um, because one of the things that I wrote down in my notes is it's hard to talk about the economy without talking about the role of the Federal Reserve, otherwise known as the Fed, the role of the U.S. dollar, the fact that the U.S. dollar is a fiat currency that isn't backed by anything of um,
Yeah.
inherent value, and so on that note, Brett, what is the Republican view on alternative forms of currency?
So that's not one that I'm incredibly versed in right from the get go. I know there is a support of alternative currencies to go that route. Um, Personal standpoint, yeah, I have questions about the Fed also in terms of its legitimacy and why it's needed. When especially you look to break it down, that the Federal Reserve is not a part of the federal government, right? That right there is an inherent issue. They don't report to the government. They're not held accountable to policies by the federal government. So, how do you let a basically privatized industry determine the course of our economic, success? Um, and a point I want to come back to real quick. We were talking about, pandemic aside, pumping $2.3 trillion into the economy. Um, the question is, why was that necessary? right? It was such a short window of time to look at the impacts of what was happening to the economy. How do we know? Nothing played out long enough to see if that was going to be a good idea or a bad idea, or if the economy can self-regulate itself, which oftentimes the free market will do if you let it. Right. And so my thought would be that is, why did the government feel that it was their place to step in and do that? That's probably
So
a for
I guess
discussion.
the question is, yeah, do we think the government should wait until the economy crashes before it acts? Or, because what you're saying, what it sounds like you're saying is, if we see us going down the road and we can see where we're headed, at what point do we say, okay, let's not go off the cliff and let's act? And so I think what you saw, what my perception is, what we saw is lawmakers saying we don't want to let the economy go off the cliff. We don't want to crash. We don't want to get into a depression. We don't want to find ourselves having to, dig ourselves out of a major recession that will take longer and have a greater impact over time. So we'll infuse, we'll stimulate the economy this way. What I hear you saying is, well, we didn't really know that that's where we were headed, so we should have waited longer to see. And I just feel like I have a hard time saying what do we think was going to happen. Again, we had all these people out of work. So we weren't producing, the same number of goods, and there was this huge impact on our level of production. The global market was disrupted as far as the whole issue when it comes to supply. And the reality is, I don't, under normal circumstances, perhaps the market could have regulated itself, but I don't see that the facts indicated that would have happened. So I guess my question is, if the government can see, hey, the economy is being impacted by external forces, right? Because it's not like we weren't in normal times. So the economy itself is being impacted by external forces. Here we have a global pandemic that's impacting the United States economy. Does the government then just stand back and say, let's see, wait and see, or do they have a role to play is the question.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those, we all kind of play fortune teller in that instance, right? Because we're
Mhm.
always looking like, well, what could happen? And yeah,
Mhm.
it could happen, it could not happen. But when, at least from most economic standpoints, when you go to pump money into a situation like that, yeah, you may not go off the cliff as fast, but you're not changing direction, right? You're still headed to the cliff. You may have just slowed the progress of getting there, right?
But
And
we
that's
didn't have a
where,
recession.
I I have a controversial idea, especially since the government decided that they were going to close down a lot of stuff, particularly government offices. That should mean that the government infrastructure required less money to run because people weren't going into the office, which means they weren't turning the lights on, they weren't turning the computers on, et cetera, et cetera. People weren't paying for parking and for transportation, whatnot. So instead of infusing artificial money into the economy, they could have just lowered taxes for everybody for that time because the government didn't need as much money to run in the first place.
Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to look. I will say one of the things when I was advising clients, a lot of people said, "Oh, well, your overhead is lower," but to a certain extent, that was and wasn't true, right? So on the one hand, yes, you weren't paying, as high of a light bill, but you still were paying that commercial lease for that building, and that tends to be one of the bigger parts of the overhead. You're still paying wages on a lot of employees. The government wasn't laying people off in the same way that the private sector was. So you're still paying their wages, you're still paying for their health care, you're still paying. So that yes, there may be some minimal difference, but it's not enough, I would say, to have that level of to be able to say, okay, well, you're not spending this much money, so we can transfer that back to the American people. I don't think the numbers would have added up to that.
yeah, and at
Well,
least
and I'm
from
not
my
an
standpoint,
economist, so it's hard for me to know what kind of tax cut would have been required to offset the numbers. But then again, if we hadn't shut down, right? So I, I I feel like this discussion is almost proving my point that government should take a big old step back from economic policy in a lot of areas, because what we see is the government essentially making two decisions that have heavy economic impacts, right? The one is now this was primarily motivated by public health and safety, and of course we can get into that when we discuss the COVID pandemic response by the government, which will be in a later episode sometime. But um, the primary decision there was to try to keep people safe, but obviously it had a tremendous economic impact by just shutting everything down, right? So the entire economy ground to a halt. So there's decision number one, and then decision number two was now that we've killed the economy, we have to resuscitate it. How are we going to resuscitate it? We're going to infuse it with over $2 trillion of new money in the span of like a year.
Well,
And so those are two huge decisions, two huge policy implementations that the government made that created just tremendous ripples throughout the US and the world economy.
Well, I actually want to get back to one of the things that Brett said, where he said, well, why did the government have to infuse this much money into the economy? But I think one economic policy that I kind of touched on that we haven't talked about is taxes, and how, I mean, is the government recovering taxes from everybody in the rate that they should, right? So we know
Taxation is
corporations are not.
theft.
Yeah. Okay. So, I hope that road that you drove home on today has been, updated recently with taxpayer dollars. We all know that we benefit from taxpayer dollars. Now, I'm not, and the three of us, for a huge chunk of our lives, our wages were paid by taxpayer dollars, right? So, I mean, we can joke about taxes, but they serve their purpose. And we know that the richest among us are not paying their share. And so the government, to
I
me, does
kindly
play a role.
disagree. I object.
Well,
No, I won't use that.
corporations are
I won't use
people.
that
We've
term
said
with
that.
you. I'm
I
not
mean,
a
but
lawyer.
we've said that. That we've had Supreme Court decisions that say corporations are people, yet they're not paying. They're not paying at the rate that individual people are paying.
So I actually made a Facebook post about this. I think it was about 2
Mhm.
weeks ago, and it comes from the taxfoundation.org, which is a nonprofit,
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
posted the data from last year's federal tax filings. So what they
Mhm.
found was the top 1% of earners in the country paid 25.9% of the total income tax revenue for the country. The next 5 to 1, the 5 to 1% of earners, right? So the next 4%, they paid 18.9% of the taxes. And
But that
then
doesn't reflect the GDP. Like when you're talking about the total amount of money that was earned, even if they're paying 18% or 25%, that's not what they earned a larger percentage. A lot of when you're
okay,
talking about how
so
who's
they
actually
they have
earning
that
money.
they have that broken out too. So what they did was they broke out the share of total adjusted gross income, right? So they took
Mhm.
the total dollar amount of adjusted gross income reported to the IRS for all of the
Mhm.
tax returns across the country. So the top 1% took home 26.3% of the adjusted gross income, but paid 45.8% of the tax bill.
These are for people, or are we talking corporations?
These are for people, right? So,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
I think
I
for
mean,
corporate law, it probably gets a
two,
lot more
two,
twisted
yeah.
spaghetti
I
like
mean,
because of the
I
tax
think
code.
my big thing when I say the richest among us, I was referring to corporations. The other thing, I'll put a huge caveat as far as I mean, I negotiate executive salaries all the time. A lot of their compensation isn't in the form of pay, right? They're getting
Yeah.
equity, and their
And
way
I would
that
do
they
that too, right? Because
set up.
that's the
And,
smart
right,
thing to do.
I'm not, but I'm not disputing that. But I guess I also want to paint a picture. I guarantee if we look at how much money Elon Musk made last year, when it's just a dollar amount that was taxable, I guarantee it's minimal compared to what he actually received as far as his full comp, because he knows how to set that up. Because he had someone like me who helped him set up a good comp
Yep.
package, right? But the companies themselves are not, that are getting these huge tax incentives through multiple different programs, right? Which is also on the hands of the government. So I will be critical of the Democratic Party in a lot of the policies and the incentives that they've given to these businesses over the years, but they haven't coupled it with tax regulation, right? So you incentivize this company, you help grow the company because you've given them either government contracts, or you've made it easier or more appealing for them to operate in the United States or in different locations throughout the US, but then you don't tax them, or you don't close the loopholes in the tax law so that the government is getting revenue from these companies as they become more and more successful. And so then you don't have then we are running more of a deficit. You don't have as much money to then pump back in the economy in a better way than just saying we're going to just print more money there's other ways that the government could have approached, infusing, I should say, like stimulating the economy in other than the way that they did. But some of it's limited on where we were with the budget that year too. And why aren't we bringing in more revenue? Because we're not collecting taxes in the way that we should.
So why don't we just cut government spending so we don't need as much revenue?
I mean, that's the thing. So we could have a conversation about government spending, but the reality is there's certain things that the government has to spend money on. I think we all agree that the government needs a national defense, and therefore you need tax dollars to pay for the national defense. I don't think,
not against that, but you look at where they're spending the money and how they're doing it. I mean, we've had since the 1950s these wars that have approached decades in length, where previously the government would have operated and said, hey, we're going to do a war tax. But then eventually the people say, hey, your war is unjust. We're not going to support it anymore. You're fired. And they vote new people in and they stop paying for it.
And I agree.
Now we don't have that choice.
I mean, and I don't want to get us off track, but I think one thing I saw in being in active duty is that how disconnected the reality of people in the military and we're forced to pay attention to the wars that are being fought. We're forced to be aware of the costs that those wars have. But most people, they don't feel it, right? Because it's all volunteer service. And like you said, we're not buying war bonds to pay for the war. We're not being taxed to pay for the war. I actually agree with that, if we're going to have these big programs where, what is it? I forget the percentage, but every year, I mean, we all lived through, what's going to come out, like for some reason, the defense authorization, what's the name of the bill every year for the funds of the military? It's for some reason,
National Defense.
NDA, yeah. So the NDA every year, I remember waiting to see, okay, is this X, Y, and Z going to get funded? Right. And so I agree with you, Brett, in the sense that we should take a look at how the government spends money, but I don't like where I disagree is the general statement, well, we just need to curb government spending. And I guess the question is, well, then on what and how? Because there are things that we have to spend money on.
I think it's hard for us to have a discussion about the economy and the role of the government without talking about how the government spends its money. So looking at so I think one of the things, and this is policy based, right? So it goes directly to our topic of what is the government's role in the economy. So one of the policies that was laid down, decades ago and has never really been challenged is the fact that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the interest on our national debt have been decreed must pay bills, and therefore they are never debated annually when we talk about the government's budget, right? And when you look at the portion of the pie that those make up, we're talking about the vast majority. So Social Security is 21%, health insurance, which includes Medicare and Medicaid, is 24%, interest on the debt is 10%, right? So we're over 50% there. Almost 55% of it is just part of the budget that they never debate. They never say, should we be moving money around? Should we be paying this much in this?
Because it's unpopular. So when we started this conversation, Brett, one of the first things he said was by the people, right? The government should be for the people, by the people. The people like those programs, right? When you talk about cutting, in particular, Social Security, especially now we're talking about the boomer generation is aging, and actually, like my mom just now started, she retired a year ago. Now she's getting Social Security. It's not popular because people expect that they've paid into these programs. Now we know that they are going to get more out than they paid in, but it is what it is. But it's unpopular, right? The people support those programs, and that's why they don't get debated, because politicians, the first time you get up there and start talking about cutting Social Security, then there's a political ad from the other side. I think Paul Ryan tried to make a career on some of the things that you're talking about, and Paul Ryan's not only is he no longer Speaker of the House, he's no longer in Congress, right? So I think that's whether we should talk about those. I think it's off the table because it's an unpopular position to take with the American people.
Well, that's kind of a rough way to take it, though, because just because it's unpopular doesn't mean it shouldn't be talked about.
Well, I mean,
right?
it's
Like that's
unpopular in the sense that you could lose your, I mean, people will vote you out, right? We live in a democracy, a representative democracy, right? So if the people
yeah,
if they're, if politicians believe that if they take this stance, then voters are going to say, no, that's not what I want, and vote them out. That's why you don't see politicians doing it. It goes right back to the example you gave about a tax on war, right? If people don't want to pay that tax, that they're going to punish the representatives by saying we want somebody else in office. What I'm saying is there is a political price to pay when you start talking about cutting specifically Social Security and Medicare, because so much of the population has accepted that that's one of the entitlements that they'll receive because they paid into it over, as long as they've been working.
yeah. And I mean, with the people that have paid into it, I totally understand that. But that's a whole other topic we could have too
Yeah.
around should you actually have a government funded retirement? My take would be
especially
no.
one
Like
that
that is your
earns
own
at
personal thing to
best.
do.
Yeah, but
Sorry,
Yeah,
we
Dion, what
do.
was
especially
that?
I
one
mean,
that earns at best like maybe half of what any other like corporate 401k or IRA program would do.
Yeah, you
I
get
mean,
just as much as putting in your savings account.
the
Like
thing is,
there are much better ways to earn interest on that.
there probably are. The reality is, once you have a program as large as Social Security in place, if you're going to change it, reform it, you have to really think through and have some solution that provides the same level of support or safety net for people before you talk about taking it away, right? So whenever the government
Yeah.
takes things away, we know. So whether it should have been there, that's an argument we could have had in the 1930s, but here we are, right?
Yeah, but I
And
mean, when
so
an
Nothing
alligator's
is
got a hold of your
immutable.
foot, like how much do
it's
you,
not. But what's the
let him
solution?
eat before you
What are you
cut your
replacing it with?
losses?
But what are you replacing it with?
So I think
Not a
there's a
government
great
program.
quote. There's a great quote here that is attributed to Alexander Fraser Tytler, and he says, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury." And I think that's where we are with programs like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Um, you know, it's if you look at how Social Security functions, it essentially functions a like a savings account, right? It's not investing in anything. It's at best, I think it's got like government bonds that some of the money can go into to earn a little bit of interest, but it's basically like a savings account where like people put money in and then people take money out, but it's not like it's a piggy bank. That's all it is. Like some people put money in and then other people come in and take money out. And that is completely unsustainable, especially when you have a system of fiat currency which just naturally will inflate over time.
I'm not. I would say the reality is, again, I'm not saying Social Security is the best system that we could have in place. I'm not saying that it doesn't lend itself to needing some type of reform. I am saying, though, if we are the solution to eliminating Social Security, what I've never heard is a discussion of, well, what replaces it, right? What do you replace it with? And what should the system be, right? And that's the discussion that if we would need to have. It can't just be get rid of it. It's then, well, what do we replace it with? What are the options? And I would even take it away because Social Security, I think, yes, is more of a purely economic program. But when you talk about Medicare and Medicaid, then you're starting to talk about what kind of country do we want to be when it comes to how humane we treat people when they are sick and are dying. Do we just say, sorry, you don't have the money, you can't afford any type of healthcare, and you couldn't afford your own insurance, so therefore you're not entitled to any level of healthcare? Like that's becomes, I think we talked about regulating morality. That starts to like creep into who do we want to be as a country, um, especially with
That's
Medicaid.
probably
You got
a
to,
topic
yeah,
for another
yeah.
another
But,
podcast
but
as well. It is
there's an
socialized
economic
medicine.
impact. That's the reality. There's an economic impact to when we talk about who we want to be as a country, right? When you talk about child poverty, right? So when, they were talking about the tax credit and how that helped to, bring certain number of children out of poverty. that comes at a cost and an economic cost, but is it worth it? I guess the question is what's worth it, right? When we're talking about spending money for the good of the people. Yes, it may cost us from a dollar amount, but is it worth it from a moral standpoint?
So Thea, I want to come back to something that you said, which was, I hope you enjoyed driving on that road, and who's gonna there are certain things that government has to take taxes to pay for and stuff. And I
Mhm.
would challenge that premise and go back to first principles on that, which is I think a lot of us just assume that because the government has subsumed certain industries and the government takes tax dollars to then provide those services, that that's the way that it must be. And I would just say that in many, many cases, that's probably not actually true. That you could come up with a completely private way of doing that that would function equally well. We've just been used to the government doing it for us for so long that we just default to the government must be the one that has to do it.
I say I
I
just
just
drove out to Philadelphia this weekend
Mhm.
for a business trip, and it
Mhm.
cost me $66 round trip to drive on the
Toll roads.
Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Yeah.
Right? Like, fine, if I want to use that road, I have to specifically pay for it.
But
As
there's
I said,
also
there are
ano
alternative solutions.
but there's an alternative road you could have taken, right? Most people take toll roads tend to be the quickest way, but there's another road you can take, right? So,
Yeah, but it's
like,
still the same idea. Like the roads had to be
yeah,
paid for in some capacity. That's just
yeah.
one example.
But, I mean,
They could have all been toll roads.
if you were going to completely eliminate public roads, right, and use this concept of where now we're dependent. I think it's interesting. We talked about earlier the discomfort of having the Federal Reserve not be a government agency, but now our conversation's gotten to a point where we're now saying, well, we should privatize public roads, and that might be a better system than what we have, and you can use, okay, you have the roads, the fire department, a lots of public services. So when my house catches on fire, we're saying that should be privatized. The military, right? So who's going to pay for the national defense? Should we have been privatized? We all saw how well that goes with privatization of the military. So, you know what I mean? I'm just saying you can pick an example, but I just think the reality of the conversation is that there are certain things that tax dollars are going to go to, certain services that the government is going to provide based on our model of government, right? And based on the things that we've agreed to over time as a society. And when we talk about government spending, I'm always like, I struggle with the lack of acknowledgement that there are things that the government has to spend money on, right? The government has bills to pay, that are just bare necessities. I agree with I'm happy to have the conversation of like Social Security. Should the government provide for retirement? I think that's a fair conversation for us to have. But then it's like, well, if my house catches on fire, should the government be the one to come put it out? Well, if my house catches on fire and it's not put out, well, then my neighbor's house could be affected, and then the whole block goes up, and now we all suffered when we could have, you know what I mean? So there's sometimes these services have a greater good that are worth spending money on.
Yeah, and
And that's
yeah, my point is just to have the conversation around it because it's oftentimes when we have these conversations, we have like, oh, well, we're currently in this ditch over here. Well, the solution is jump to the ditch on the other side of the road. And
yeah,
that's not the answer, right? But oftentimes you have to start with hyperbole to get the conversation going to say, okay, how can we actually find a solution that actually is effective and that works, right? Because like we've talked about this before, it's the idea like, well, just because we've done something for so long doesn't mean it's the right answer,
I agree
right?
with that.
We talked about it before. It's like you come into a new organization, like, well, it's just the way we've always done it. My immediate response is, you're probably doing it wrong, right?
Or I guess what I found with that and is you come into an organization, someone will say this is how we've always done it, and you'll be like, okay, well, that can't be the right answer. But then what's also tends to not be the right answer is chuck out everything we've done and just start with something new. The answer tends to be somewhere in the middle, right? Where
Yeah,
the thing the thing that you've always done probably needs to evolve and be reformed in some way, but it was founded in some reason why you were doing it in the realm of like that way, right?
yeah, and
And
that's
so I
the
think the opposite, like you said, don't chuck one and go into a different ditch.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like the whole point of discussion, like, I threw out the toll road example just to like say, hey, there is a solution out there. Now, is it the right solution? Is it the most effective solution?
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that, right? But it's
Mhm.
one of those like you have to at least broaden your mind to apply that critical thought process to say, okay, is the way that we're doing things really the best to go about it? And like Dion said, there's a lot of industries that the government has entrenched themselves in, but it doesn't mean that they should. This goes back to a previous discussion that we had around, government should only do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. They really should be a last resort solution to where if you need something in your life, I know the house burning is an example. Um, I mean, there's nothing to say that there can't be privatized fire departments. And whoever
Mhm.
provides the best service, the quickest service at the best cost continues to thrive in business. Right. And I'm not saying it's the solution, but it is the potential for a solution. Because again,
Yeah.
we all have come from a background of working for the government. We have seen the just gross negligence and uh, to some level incompetence of organizations to get anything done effectively and efficiently.
Yes, yes, but here's where I'll disagree. So my background in the military, I was a force support officer, and so in the Air Force, force support officers, they made us jack of all trades. So we actually owned most of what we called the people programs on the base. So I watched us privatize a lot of programs that had initially been done by the military themselves. One of them was food, right? So we went from providing, where it was Air Force people cooking and serving food in the dining facilities to contracting those out. Fuels was another one. When I supported a logistics readiness squadron, so we owned fuels. That was also contracted out. And I watched the headache and the inefficiency of them just not providing the same level of service that we once provided for ourselves. And I still, with certain functions, especially when a deployed environment, I will always say we could have done it better, and maybe it would have cost a little bit more, but we would have gotten our money's worth. And we were not getting our money's worth by privatizing a lot of the things that we did under the DoD.
But I wonder
And
how much of that was symptomatic of the fact that the contracts were not written very well. Um, as an acquisitions officer, I spent a lot of time on source selections and doing the contracts and writing the award fee plans and things for these different services and actually procurement buying stuff contracts. And a lot of times we the government are terrible at writing the contract structure properly to specifically ask for what we need, and we're also really bad at writing the proper incentives for the contractor to do the job well and to do the job that we actually wanted.
Well, I think you
So
you hit the nail on the head actually when you use the word incentive, because that was the word I was thinking. Having worked both in the private and the public sector, the biggest difference that I've seen is the incentive is on when you're working in the private sector, profits and profitability is going to be the incentive, right? Any contract that you're entering into, you're looking to see, is it going to bring the most value back to the whoever, whatever company is providing the service and being paid for the contract. That is their incentive. But when you're in the public sector, the incentive normally is mission accomplishment. What is the mission? Accomplishing the mission. And those are, and a lot of times those are at odds with one another. They just are, right? And it's interesting. I will say, like, corporate America in a lot of ways can function more efficiently than the military did, because like they just are not going to spend money on things that don't work. But then they cut things, or they don't place value on certain things that, like, from a public standpoint, when you're running a public organization, you just can't afford to cut those things, or you can't afford to take those shortcuts, because at the end of the day, your mission is to accomplish X, right? And X isn't profits. So I think when we talk about government spending and how we're looking at it, it always has to be tied to, well, what's the thing we're trying to accomplish with what money we're spending as a government. And that does have an economic impact overall. So it's not always going to be the cheapest, but is that the goal, or is it to get it right?
so
I mean, my
Thea,
thought would be best value, but
Yeah. Yeah. If it adds
so
value.
Thea,
Yeah.
we're coming up on time here.
Yeah.
So I was gonna say if you want to go ahead and wrap up your thoughts on the government's role in the economy, and then I'll go next, and then we'll turn it over to Brett, and then he can lead us into what's been making us happy this week.
So I think the interesting thing is I think this conversation very much aligned with our very first conversation of just what is the role of government, right? So if as a Democrat, I do believe the government has a role to play and an interventionist role to play in the society and how we live. And I do seek the government to take that active role. And so as a result of that, my goal is not necessarily for the government to spend less money. It's to spend money fulfilling the needs of the people. And how we define what those needs are is up for discussion as what we've been having. But I think that just the fact that the government's spending money or the government spending a lot of money isn't the end of the conversation. It really needs to be, are the needs of the people being met? How are they being met? And is the government, the way that the government is influencing the economy, is it to try to help the American people live a better life, right? Or live the life that they seek to live, right? And creating a fair economy so that everybody in society does have some type of equal opportunity to have a good job, to live in an environment that is conducive to like just basic human rights, right? I think that all of those regulations hopefully seek to help improve the way of life and allow Americans to live the American dream, right? So I do think that costs money. And I do think to a certain extent, you get what you pay for, and you get what you pay for in life. And I think the same is true of our government, right? And so I do think that you are going to have more spending. And I do think that there is a role for us to pay taxes so that we can get something back as a society as a whole. So that's where I stand. I understand that means that the government, I'm not saying we just balloon the budget and continue to run as large deficits as we have, but I do think that there is a balance there that we should seek to strike. All right.
All right. I guess from my standpoint, what a lot of times what I hear, and you're right, this does go back to our first episode, like what is the overall role of government, period. A lot of what I hear from the Republicans and the Democrats a lot of times is, we know better than you what you need for your life. So we're going to implement these policies, these rules, these regulations, these laws that protect you from yourself. And I don't want that. Right? You mentioned in your closing arguments, Thea, that um, we can the government does need money for something, and we can talk about what how that's best spent and everything. And I would argue that how that's best spent is by letting me keep it, and letting me take care of myself and my own, letting you keep it and letting you take care of yourself and your own. Now, am I a complete anarchist that believes that the government should not have a penny, and that no, that's not what I'm saying. I recognize that certain things, especially national defense, require a unified national um, power behind it, and that includes the dollar. Right? They have to have a budget. We can't rely on privatizing national defense. But I also argue that, as I just said a few minutes ago, that the government has probably overreached into many broad sectors of the economy that they simply don't need to be in, and are probably doing more damage than they are doing good because of the inefficiencies that are just inherent in the way that the government functions. And I'll turn it over to Brett.
Yeah, I guess kind of from my standpoint, coming back to where we started in this, I talked about the free market and that the Republicans are very much for that in terms of capitalism. Understand that Republicans don't advocate just completely unchecked industry, right? They of course support reducing government regulations and foster economic growth, but there has to be regulations when necessary. And that always comes in place when you're talking about ensuring public safety, fairness, environmental protections. Um, there's a lot that kind of plays with that. Thea, one area that I would kind of disagree on is that it's not the government's role to meet the needs of the people. Because there's a whole conversation we can have there in terms of needs versus rights. Because, I'm in agreement with Dion. On the standpoint of let me do with my money what I want to do with my money. And if I choose poorly with it, there's consequences that go with that. I don't need a personal government bailout because I made bad financial decisions, right? It's one of those that maybe there should be less focus on what you do with your money and more, I'm not going to say government education because that doesn't necessarily go well, but more opportunity to learn about what can you do with your money, right? And teach people economic principles. I mean, I think we'd fare a far bit better by learning economic principles in school than studying Shakespeare or a lot of the other stuff that the public school system deems necessary. Again, topic for another podcast. Well, and
Yeah,
I think
public
this is just,
education is definitely one that we should talk about sometime.
yeah. And see, people I think need to realize too that all of these topics, they're not separate, right? They're not
Yeah.
isolated from each other. Like it's a giant bowl of spaghetti, right? This isn't like a waffle where you have individual compartments for each little dollop of syrup. Everything is mixed together, everything touched. So you can't have a discussion about one topic without delving into others,
Yes.
right? But when we're talking economics, my thoughts are let the people have their choices, right? And like there's consequences that come with that. And yes, the government needs to make sure that there is fair opportunity, right? Because there's again a whole discussion around, equality and sameness are not the same thing, right? Because equal opportunity doesn't mean equal outcomes. But even then, we didn't all start with equal opportunities because there's an inherent differences that come with that. None of us are ever equal in what we have, and no one ever will be. So by letting people have the free choice of where they spend their money, because again, if a business is able to thrive because they provide a good service, they have a good product, they take care of their customers, people will vote with their dollars as to what businesses survive and which businesses don't. And that's where my then viewpoint goes to, or the government is there to keep regulations in place that are around safety and environmental protections, things like that, deregulation as much as possible, but give people choice. So anyway, I know this will all carry into further discussions. We'll have opportunities. I'm actually looking forward to Will's take on this in his not in episodes that he gets to post on that. So it'll be pretty cool. But yeah, let's kind of roll into what's making us happy. Since I'm already chatting here, I can throw mine out. I had a chance to hang out with some of my business mentors, or business partners and mentors out on the East Coast this weekend. We were hanging out in Philadelphia and Delaware area, and it is just a joy because the people I was surrounded with, I was probably the third oldest in the room. I'm 43. There's a couple of people that were older than me, but everybody else that was in there is these entrepreneurs that are in their 20s and 30s, and they are just excited about their future and the prospects of what they can do. And it's just fun to be around that uplifting spirit and just people that are hopeful for the future. So, I mean, that's definitely what makes me happy. So, Thea, what about you?
Okay, so I have two right now. So we're taping this on October 20th. It is the bottom of the sixth, and my Dodgers are up 6-3. So I've been kind of following it while we've been talking. So that's one. Hopefully we're going to the World Series. It's exciting. Okay, but my other thing, I actually brought a visual. I garden. So I have a little bit of a yard in California, and I try to like grow as much as I can in every little inch of my yard. And so about a year ago, I planted potatoes along between like my shrubs. And I've been, it's hard because when potatoes, I learned to actually have potato bags. So now I have bags, but I still have some of the ones that were planted in the ground. But it's hard. They grow really well in the ground, but then you don't know like when to pick them, right? You have to kind of dig to see how they're doing, right? So I realized I had ignored a corner of my yard. And this week I went out there and I said, well, let me check, because it was kind of overgrown. And I'm digging and I just kept hitting. And I was like, oh my gosh, is this a potato or something impeding? This is my potato that
Oh my
this
God.
is the potato I pulled out of my garden. It is huge. It's a regular
God.
potato. Look how big it is. and
That
I was
is
like,
awesome.
oh, I grew because it looks like it should be like a squash. This is a russet potato.
You could feed like
fantastic.
you could feed like a family of 20 mashed potatoes with that for Thanksgiving.
And I'm like, that's what I think it will hold till Thanksgiving because, potatoes don't go bad. And I think this will be our mashed potatoes for Thanksgiving. And that will make me feel good because the whole family will know the story behind it. But this potato is making me so happy. Like yeah. So that's what's making me happy this week.
That is amazing. That's also amazing that you have enough land in California to grow that size potato.
Yes. Yes.
All right. For me, it's not nearly as exciting as either of those, I'm afraid to say. But for me, it's been last week I think I talked about my woodworking. I finished that and it's now in it's in the bedroom where it's supposed to be. That was great. But actually it's been taking a little bit of a break from that, and I rediscovered a PlayStation game that I started a while ago and then just got distracted and never came back to, and that is Jedi Survivor. And
Oh,
you play this Jedi who survived the purge and is on the run
yeah,
from the Empire, and it's open
yeah.
world and you're running around, and like for people who don't know, I'm just a huge Star Wars fan. Grew up on it on the Orig Tridge, right?
Mhm.
And so like just being able to run around with a lightsaber and force powers is just 5-year-old Dion's dream, and I just love that. So that's what's been making me happy this week.
So my question, Dion, is: do you still have the license plate?
I do still have the license plate actually on my German sports car. So the license plate that Brett is referring to is it says and the PSU is because I graduated from Penn State. So I have had that license plate. I think I had it at Wright Pat, didn't I? So I must have had that
Yeah.
license plate for 20 some odd years now.
Well, because I
I
always
didn't.
remember Greg talking about the one that he's. I'm going to get one that says.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, Dion, you'll
yeah.
appreciate that. My dogs' names are Anakin and Obi-Wan. I didn't
Oh,
realize you were a
nice.
big Star Wars fan. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So yeah, so I have Obi-Wan and
They
Anakin
don't
are my
fight each other all the time, do they?
no, and they're misnamed. Their personalities should be shifted. So Obi, he should definitely be Anakin, and Anakin should be Obi, but it's fine. But yeah, that so whenever I take them to the vet and someone knows Star Wars, especially the Anakin one, they'll be like Star Wars, and I'll be like yes, yes,
Nice.
So yeah.
That is
All right, so
awesome.
that's a good way for us to end it.
All right. So next week we have not picked a topic yet. We'll have to discuss with Will. I think next week, unfortunately, Thea will not be able to join us, so Will step in and we'll have another episode with just three of us. But I promise you, viewers and listeners, we will get back to our normal format as soon as we can, and we'll have all four of us here to discuss. So we will talk to you and see you later. And please remember to like and subscribe. All right. Talk to you next time.